their own reporting. So we have a reporting fellowship opportunity that's available to all students at Campus Consortium Partners. Forsyth is one of those partners. So this allows you to submit a proposal to do your own reporting project. You come up with this proposal on your own. We don't assign you to do a story. You can select something that you're passionate about, a story that you want to cover, and we fund you to go tell that story. You don't need to have any journalism experience to pursue this project. In fact, we give a lot of grants to students who this might be their first time doing any sort of journalism, but we're there to help you along the way with mentorship. We pair you with one of our professional grantees like Natalie to help you. Maybe they've had experience reporting in the area where you'd like to report, or they have experience reporting on that topic. And I see in the chat here, we do have a link or an email, excuse me, where you can send any questions you may have. I'll also, when I'm done sharing a little bit more, I'll share the email we have as well. If you want to ask any questions, my colleague Libby Moeller and also my colleague Kem Sawyer manage this program. And they're really fantastic about answering questions even before you submit your proposal. So in short, it's a short proposal. It's like 250 words for you to tell us what you want to do. Show us some of your work. That might just be like an essay you've written for class or something similar. And it's just about kind of, selling your project to us, why you want to tell the story, and why you're the right person to pursue it. So if you have any more questions, definitely reach out to us. I'll make sure someone gets back in touch with you, but really looking forward to reading your proposals and seeing some great reporting projects this year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Holly. Okay, I just want y'all to know that I've been looking forward to this all week long. I'm so excited. Today, our guest speaker is Natalie Alcoba. She is an Argentine-Canadian journalist based in Buenos Aires. She writes extensively about the feminist movement in Argentina and is interested more broadly in collective organization in Latin America and how resistance and community are forged on the so-called margins. She has co-produced short documentaries on the impact of the pandemic on female workers, on land occupations, and the legalization of abortion. Prior to moving to Argentina, she was a reporter for more than a decade in Canada at newspapers such as the National Post, the Toronto Star, the Montreal Gazette, and the Hamilton Spectator. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in now or in future. I really appreciate your interest and the opportunity to talk a bit about the work that I've been doing alongside my collaborator Anita, who was my partner on this project. I'll just talk a little bit about, just briefly, my trajectory, maybe flesh out a little bit of how it is that I got here. So I was born in Argentina. My family immigrated to Toronto when I was very young. Spent practically my whole life there, and my journalistic career as well, working in a variety of newsrooms. The last one was as an editor at Vice News, and after a few years doing that, I wanted to get back closer to stories, to telling the stories firsthand, to the street, to conversations, to interviews. A lot of what I find really fulfilling about this work is those moments where you get to connect with other people. The writing is good too, but the exchange is really invigorating for me. And so I turned to Argentina, which is a place that's had this really important, has played an important role for me, as an immigrant in Canada, in terms of constructing my own identity in that place. And I've been here many times, seen lots of family here, and it had this kind of familiar but foreign element to it that felt like it might be a good way in which to change something in my life. And so I came in 2019 and kind of got my bearings. I wasn't sure what kind of interest there was going to be in the work or in news from here, and I was happily surprised that there is a great deal of interest from international publications to what was happening here. I mean, it's a society that's super dynamic, that's that's volatile, that's creative, that has a lot of collective organization, all things that really interested me. And of course, after a year here, we were all kind of blown back by the pandemic and recalibrating. But the pandemic also, at least, brought opportunities for me. And one of the important ones was meeting and being able to pair up with my collaborator on this particular project that I'm going to talk about today with the Pulitzer Center. A photojournalist, her name is Anita Pouchard-Serra. We were paired up through an assignment, we were paired up on an assignment. We didn't know each other, and we hit it off. We became friends, and being a freelancer can be lonely at times. The freedom to do what you want, but you are oftentimes in your apartment by yourself. So it's been really satisfying to find somebody that we can crack open our heads and scheme up different ideas and bring our own perspectives to them. So together we kind of came to this story, this project. I believe the Pulitzer Center had put out a call about a COVID story, stories related to COVID and the economics, the economic implications. And both Anita and I had noticed, that this particular story of this enormous cohort of workers who were in many respects, rendered invisible in the society, despite the fact that they were indispensable to it. So there's about 1.4 million people who work in what might be described as in the domestic sector. Here, often there's a term used of household workers. They're people that are cleaning homes, taking care of elderly, taking care of children. And here they're overwhelmingly women. 99% of that workforce is women. And like I said, it's a giant number. I think they represent about 8% of all workers in Argentina and 17% of working women, which is astounding. And in the pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, they were one of the sectors that was the hardest hit, really, in many ways. And they're already, a group that is incredibly marginalized. Although in Argentina there is legislation that states that household workers should be registered by their employers, and that means their employer should be paying into a pension fund. Their employer should be guaranteeing basic worker protections such as paid sick leave or being able to take time off. The vast majority, even though that's the law, it's been the law for several years, and it was an important victory for the group when it was established. The reality is that the vast majority of workers are not registered for many reasons. Employers don't want to. Sometimes the women themselves would prefer not to because they find the flexibility or what they can earn on an hourly wage is greater. Of course, not to go too much on a tangent, but we need to unpack that, because that's like a product of conditions that already are not valuing the work at a level that's appropriate to begin with. So it's more complex than just saying they don't want to be registered. But the reality is that they're not registered, and so they're working day to day at an hourly wage. If they're not working, they're not getting paid. So that means that if they do need to take time off for sick reasons, if they have they're not earning. They got to be working to be getting paid. So you can imagine what the pandemic would do to that sector of workers. And it's also, add to that, it was a sector that was among the last to be given permission to go back to work. Argentina had a really long and a really long quarantine, restrictive quarantine in terms of what sectors could go back to work, and it was a continuous thing because of the time in which the pandemic hit here. We were heading into fall, so there wasn't that like summer reprieve. It was just months on end of very little activity. But for many people, that was just not an option, and so they went out to work anyhow. And that in many cases was also the case for these women. In some, in some situations, they, their employers may have reclassified their job description in order to allow them to, get them the permission to be able to go onto the street, to come to their house and clean. But of course, that also added another level of risk, because this is the middle of the pandemic, and these are women that, for the most part, have to use public transportation to get around, and so their exposure to the virus itself was deeply problematic. Not to mention, of course, that there's different experiences within that group of workers. There are some that are in even more precarious positions than others. Women who are migrants from neighboring countries, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, and who, even just the act of going out adds this other level of risk if their status is a bit, their legal status is a bit gray. So all of this global picture of what it was that these women were facing had kind of captured our attention. But in particular, I mean, what we were especially interested in was that context was driving more women than before to kind of turn to each other and organize in a collective way, to raise grab the microphone, hit the street, raise their voices in ways that they really hadn't before. Of course, Argentina is a country with a strong union culture, and unions exist that represent these women, but many of them were not active in them. They didn't feel that they actually represented their interests or what they were going through. And the pandemic was a moment of like a switch for them, right? Like kind of pushed already on the margins, pushed even more so, in many cases, like literally needing to turn to each other to be able to put food on the table, through soup kitchens, through bags of groceries that were being provided by different organizations that were helping them, and saying, we need to organize collectively. We need to form new syndicates. We need leaders. We need government to see us and to hear us. And that was what Anita and I were particularly drawn to. That in that moment of extreme vulnerability, that there was strength that was being built, and for some, like a new sense of seeing themselves, a new identity was building, and we hoped to focus on that. So what the Pulitzer Center, the grant from the Pulitzer Center, most valuably allowed us to do was to spend time. As freelancers, we're also battling the economics of our own little worlds and how much time we get to spend on each story. And so with this funding, we were able to map out a plan that ultimately tried to spend a bit of time in their shoes. So we began reaching out to different organizations, that were already kind of in the media, talking about these new unions that had formed, and did that grassroots outreach work, and slowly kind of started to find different people that we could spend a bit more time with. We went to meetings of these new unions where they all gathered together, in a small room in a very Buenos Aires building. Like, they've got these old turn of the century gorgeous buildings that are kind of decaying, but they'd gather there and talk about what it was like, the birth of these of a new union. For example, these women gathered together. They'd never before been in that kind of position, talking about like what their own lived experiences, and agreeing that they were going to kind of band together in hopes of raising some kind of attention for their cause. So through that kind of outreach, we decided to we spent most of our time focusing on two two women. And maybe what I'll do now is I will just share a couple of the articles because I'd like you to see them too. And I'll tell you a bit about them and what we learned from them too. Okay, so I mean, because sorry for all these ads. Impossible to not be distracted on websites sometimes. So I think what's always kind of important with this kind of work is you set out to talk about a group of people, but I think it's important to understand that it's not a homogeneous group, and so women come from different experiences, different like within a sector that may be marginalized. There is privilege. There are some that are in more quote unquote privileged positions than others for a variety of reasons. So this is Estella. I mean, both of the two women are Estella and Angelica. And there's things about them that are similar, and then there are things that in which they diverge. But they're both women who are in their 50s, and they're both women who've been working in the sector for many years. Estella in particular, since she was 19. She's 59. She, of the two, would perhaps be has greater privileges. I mean, she works predominantly in the capital of Buenos Aires and stays in a small studio apartment that she shares with her husband, who is a caretaker in a building. But they also have a home in the province. But she has that ability to not have this enormous. I mean, there are women that are commuting 2 hours to get to their work, but she's able to stay in the city and kind of move around like within a smaller geographic area. She's somebody though who had never prior to the pandemic had really never been active in a union, had never considered herself someone that would be a spokesperson on an issue like this, and that is the position that she ended up taking. It's the union that I was mentioning. We were there for the start of a particular union. It's this union that she's the president of. Here she is, getting ready for a day at work. Here she is at a protest outside of the Congress building. This is like somebody who now takes the microphone, has a megaphone, and is speaking to her counterparts and trying to inspire, trying to motivate, trying to kind of articulate what their cause is, and trying to give the women that are in positions like her hope and a sense that this kind of action can make a difference, if not on a grand scale, then certainly on a more individual level, right? Like when somebody, I think, steps into that position of being that speaker, there's something that's happened there that's happened there for her, as it has for other people in that same position, that is about how she sees herself. So that's Estella, and we spent in both cases, with Angelica and with Estella, we spent a day with them. So we went to their homes in the morning. We chatted. We had coffee with them. We were there as they got ready. We were in Estella's house in particular as she got ready, and then we took that ride. That bus ride, 2-3 buses to the other end of the city, to feel what that's like to do that. I mean, it's a fraction of what it is like, but it's like a moment of what it is that they see along that road. What's that physical exhaustion like? What is their day? What does their world look like? For us, it was important that journey that in many cases, in particular with Angelica, whom I will, let me grab a different image here. In particular with Angelica, that contrast was quite stark. This is her at a protest, at a demonstration as well. But she lives. So her story is that she's a migrant from Peru. She came to Argentina several years ago, working for a particular family. She took care of the child, and for whatever reason, that job ended, and so she found herself in Buenos Aires, having to reimagine what that life was like, and she found work in cleaning homes. During the pandemic, that work had kind of like whittled down to she had one person who continued to employ her 2 days a week, total of like 6 hours a week, earning her 10,000 pesos a month, which the exchange rate changes so quickly in Argentina. I'm not quite sure what that is, but it's what that was worth at the time. But it's very little. It's certainly not enough to live on. And so she had to turn to soup kitchens to survive in the thick of the pandemic. She lives in one of the poor neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. This is her street that she walks down, and every morning she takes 3 buses to get to work. It was interesting. She was saying, like she could take 2 buses because that last stretch isn't that long. She could walk it, but actually she can't because there's something wrong with her knee. But she isn't taking care of it because she can't afford time off work that she'd inevitably have to take to recover after the operation. Argentina has public health care. She has access to an operation if that's what was necessary, but the time off she couldn't afford that. So she takes 3 buses to get to work, and we took that bus ride with her, and she literally like sees, Buenos Aires, Latin America is a region of extreme, like the gap between middle class, rich, and poor is enormous, and you see that in Buenos Aires. You see that on her bus ride. She sees the face of that city change, and she ends up in a fairly wealthy neighborhood where she goes to work. And she also was somebody who had never organized. Here she is. Here are the 2 of them actually at that same protest. She's somebody who had never organized before this, and now was this co-founder of a union, specific. It's kind of like a branch of this older group. But that had started in the pandemic, and so she's on this bus ride going to work. She's manning her WhatsApp channel, figuring out like different Zoom calls, different events that they're organizing. She'd become a spokesperson, speaking to the media. Again, also that person with the megaphone. How she saw herself like quite clearly changed. And so I think for both Anita and I, and I'll close with there's a little video that I'll show you, in which you'll hear Angelica say a few things, and we'll see. So there's a photo that Anita took, and then Anita had also asked a couple of the women to film themselves at their place of work. So, with their phone, position it how they wanted, but to show at the angle that they wanted, but to show us just a snippet of what it looked like for them there, and to juxtapose those two images. So you'll see that now. But I think what was important for both of us was, this, to be able to understand that, like, to be able to show these women in their complexity, right? Like that they are not, that while the situation has placed them in a vulnerable position. And I also think it's important, there was a political scientist that we spoke to that talked about how, it's not the women themselves who are vulnerable. It's the context in which they live that makes them vulnerable. But that they're not just that they're also, in this context, in this situation, stronger, empowered in some respect, being able to see and say things that they couldn't before, that both are true, and that neither one like excludes the other, that we are both those things in these situations, and so we didn't want to fall into that trap of painting them as victims, even though the situation was victimizing them. So hopefully maybe this little video will also illustrate that. And I will go with this. And it's subtitled. So this is Angelica. Let me know if, for whatever reason. Can you hear it?
I can't hear it.
Yeah. Can you hear it now?
I hear static.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. No. That's it.
Okay.
It'll improve.
Los cambios durante la pandemia fue brutal, económicamente, psicológicamente, moralmente, que las trabajadoras todas perdimos trabajo, muchas de nosotras trabajábamos de manera informal y la verdad muchas nos encontramos en la calle. Para la sociedad nuestro trabajo es desvalorizado, olvidado, abandonado, absolutamente discriminado por el gobierno y los sindicatos burócratas, y la verdad nosotros necesitamos un sindicato que sea formado por trabajadores, que nos representa.
And that's it. Maybe I will close there. There's more I could say, but it might get a bit muddled. Perhaps questions will help clarify some stuff.
Okay, so we're going to start the Q&A. Please, if you have a question, either turn your microphone on and ask, or type it in the chat. I'm going to start, if that's okay. I have so many questions. I'm wondering first, were there any repercussions for a family that did not register one of their employees?
Not really. I mean, the government, I mean, even prior to the pandemic and after the pandemic, like, the government was saying that it was trying to encourage, not really, there's no incentive beyond saying that this is the law, but sending out letters, to households where they believed, it's kind of interesting, based on, like, the economic status of a household, they discern that person or that household may have a household worker, And so they'd send out letters reminding them, this is the law, this is what you need to, comply with. But that there's no particular repercussion. That's in fact one of the complaints of these women and of the groups that represent them, is that, you know, there isn't enough enforcement of that law. You know, there's organizations as well, like beyond these unions that are formed by women. There are groups. There's one in particular that works a lot with migrant women, and whom, you know, they do workshops and they you know, spend quite a bit of time essentially just trying to make women aware of what their rights are, right? Like, again, you know, that's one thing that there's a law, but then it's another thing for people to understand what it is that they're entitled to. Of course, that's super complicated in these power dynamics, right? Where you've got people that, you know, really don't feel comfortable in many cases, you know, demanding or saying, like, these are the conditions under which I'm supposed to be working, because you know, sometimes people do that and the employer just lets them go, and, you know, that's the end of that. Like, they understand that or they feel that fear, but, you know, but at the same time, there are women who, and I think part of this collective organization, you know, that mix of women who did kind of, you know, tell their employer, these are the conditions under which I will work, you know, that experience, and then kind of sharing that with other women who were not in that, who did not have that same experience, you know, helped, make perhaps some of the other people realize, okay, yes, you know, this is something that I can say, or someone else has said it, and it's been, so, okay, you know, just like that strength through other people's lived experience, or getting a little bit more understanding of what could happen after the fact. I mean, I think, yeah, the reality is that there isn't any particular repercussion for lack of registration.
Yeah, I'm wondering if, because these women I'm thinking about the migrant worker that comes over and maybe doesn't understand the laws, doesn't understand what their rights are, that they're probably getting educated, and that's probably a part of the empowerment process with these women.
Yeah, 100%, like along that way, along the way. But of course, I mean, you know, like, it is also, we talk about privilege. You know, not everybody has the privilege to be able to, you know, like, and by that I mean, like, the time or the bandwidth to be able to be part of an organization that might to join a workshop, even something like a demonstration, like, you know, to put in that time and that effort when you are that sole breadwinner. I mean, the pandemic, like opened things up to such an extreme level in terms of the precarity that some of these women were living through, that they really felt like they had to go to the street, or they had to take those kinds of measures. They had to join different groups. They needed that kind of camaraderie and that sisterhood around them, because it was so dire and difficult. But that there are obstacles still that just have to do with the context that puts them in a vulnerable position to begin with, that would impede someone's ability to be able to get the information that they need. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's also there's some interesting, like, strategies as well that I thought were noteworthy. This organization I was mentioning that works with migrant women, you know, one of the main challenges, for example, after, you know, if somebody says, hey, you know, this is what I think I'm owed, and your employer says, okay, well, I don't need your services anymore. And some of these women, you know, they don't even really have, like, they would have a difficult time proving that they worked for that person. They might not know exactly what that address was. They might not even really know that their employer's full name. And so, you know, one of the tools, one of the tips from this organization was, you know, when you're working, like take a photo of something that shows, like, the address of where you're at. proof that you were, take a photo of yourself in that house, right? Like you were there. Because afterwards, let's say, you're let go and you're demanding that they pay you a severance or whatever that you are entitled to.
Mm-hmm.
But those little things that are kind of simple actions, but that could help them down the road. I thought, were interesting ways of kind of like understanding of that context. Some people don't know how to read either, right? Like, so there's different level, there's different barriers to being able to then articulate and exercise your rights.
I think being that vulnerable to have that kind of collective has got to be giving some hope. I want to open it up to our guest. Are there any questions from our audience? I'm looking in the chat.
Oh, sorry. You said, so do you feel that the economy getting worse in Argentina due to the pandemic led to this push for workers to get registered? And if so, do you think that this push to register will stop if the economy gets better?
I don't even actually know that I don't think that there's, I don't even know if I can think. I don't know that there's been any change in the level of registration of workers. But so if you're asking whether or not I think that this kind of collective organization will continue even if like the economic picture improves, I think what has like the connections that have been made, the organization that has happened in this time is here to stay. But there is also the reality that people do, kind of go back to just surviving, right? Like putting food on the table, working. Like in some ways, we all fall back into our patterns of life. But there are changes, I think, that have happened on an individual level, and that equals a collective level too, that are here to stay. And I'm talking about like events that are events in solidarity, like raising, whether it's raising awareness, raising funds, putting together like a list of demands, delivering them to your elected representatives, crafting that message, like whenever there's, if there's a new piece of information that comes out about statistics, like having that person who can speak to that the experience of the household worker, like how it is that they communicate what they've been living through and what they continue to live through. I think there's been like lessons learned that are here to stay, but there hasn't really been any major change in their situation.
We have a question from Jacob in the chat. It says, "Good afternoon. Currently my mic is not working, but I did want to ask you, what do you feel would be the best step to move forward to change these issues with the law? I feel like there could be multiple facets that could be addressed, but what do you think would be the best one?"
I certainly think that like enforcement is an important piece of that, but I think like there's something deeper here, which is like the way in which we value what we call care work, which is an important conversation that we have present here in Canada. Yes, in Canada, but in Argentina. That is, that's work care work that's paid and care work that's unpaid, and both of those like fall disproportionately onto the shoulders of women. And if we're talking about paid care work, it's also work that's valued at a much lesser degree than other sorts of work. So when we talk about, women, for example, making that choice, saying, it's not worth it for me to get registered because, working like on an hourly way in an hourly way allows me to have various employers, allows me more flexibility, allows me to earn more now. But that the real issue is that, what they're earning isn't at a rate that is actually sustainable for their livelihood. So I think like so many of these questions about like economic inequality when it comes to gender are deeper than just like the enforcement of this rule now, because it's a structural issue that when we talk about like the earning gap between women and men in any society, but certainly in this one, it's not just that that you may earn less in the same position, but it's that you are directed or steered or inevitably are doing work that is valued at a lesser level, even though it is it's crucial. If we talk about this conversation of care work like this, that work is crucial for so many other aspects of society and other work to function. So I think that's like the more like the broader question or issue that needs to be addressed, and that is not something that happens overnight.
To piggyback on that, could you talk a little bit about the stigma that's placed on these women during COVID and the relationship with the families, and so how sometimes they use the closeness as an excuse when it comes to correlation with pay?
Totally, yeah. And in fact, the stigma was interesting as well, in the sense that they were also, there were scenarios in which they were even scapegoated. There were situations in which there was one in particular that was high profile. I believe she was, I don't remember if she was an actress, but a famous woman who blamed her cleaner for having brought COVID into the household, even though like she had like made it so that the woman had to stay in that home, like had her stay there. And how the positive thing about that was that framing was also very quickly called out like by other people in the media, and so the hypocrisy of that was not like allowed to just kind of stand. But there is also, as you say, that the relationship and the dynamic with the employer, which can make it tricky and make it difficult for people to then kind of essentially say, this is what my rights are, right? Like, because you feel, or many of these women feel like they're made to feel, and that may be genuine in some cases, but that they are part of the family, right? Like, this is their household. They're like trading not just in economic benefit, but in being able to I don't know, sometimes as well, like there could be, for instance, somebody working in a particular part of the city that they're not necessarily living in, but then they're able to take their children to a local school in that area. There are layers to the things that women are able to value and that assign value to based on those relationships. And that's, that's something that's present, and that's certainly like, in different organizations that work and that work to kind of empower household workers. They talk about that like, this is a working relationship that you have, kind of trying to trying to communicate that fact that like just because you may feel a certain closeness, and there is a certain closeness, you're raising their children, you're part of that home in some respects, I mean, that can't be the reason why, or that can't get in the way of you being able to articulate and exercise, like to demand what it is that you are entitled to. It is complex, and that dynamic works both ways in some cases too, right? Like that sometimes, yes, that there's a certain kind of feeling or advantage that the women can feel from that close proximity to those families. It's hard to, I don't know, sometimes it's hard to evaluate or to judge that, right? Like without being in that particular position, and without like acknowledging that there is a relationship that can be built there. It's just that whether or not that gets in the way of their in their own best interest is another question.
Yeah, definitely. Our student Allison asked, good afternoon. I was wondering how people outside of the journalism field can spread these women's stories and raise awareness.
It's a lovely question. I mean, the good old fashioned talking about it is great. I'm trying to think of, I mean, if you, perhaps like building bridges, right? Like building connections through like your own network of people. If there's the work of a particular organization, or if there's a story that moves you, or that like really like inspires something in you, that like, and you see that there's something that you have, or that people that you know that would like, there's kind of like a knowledge that can be shared. I think it's interesting to open up more pathways of knowledge sharing, like south to north. Oftentimes, there's this, and this sense that it's the north that has lessons to impart to the south, but there's so much learning and like knowledge from the south that can be transmitted up to the north. I'm just using those rough geographic terms to symbolize other things, but I think thinking about whether or not there are ways you can establish like human connections. I mean, certainly, of course, through like your social channels, talking about these issues, sharing stories, seeing that like what's like seeing the parallels between what you hear in another part of the world and how that may be manifesting itself in your own neighborhood. I think it's also super interesting. I mean, there's way more similarities between what we all live through than we realize.
Okay, wonderful. We have a question from Caitlin. Hi, I was just wondering how you got yourself in the journalism field, and especially with covering the issues you are interested in.
I as an adolescent, I guess I had one of those. I was watching Dateline one day, and I have that memory quite. I have that memory of being like a 14, 15-year-old watching Dateline, and kind of understanding like that role of passing, like the role of journalism, the role of like understanding what was happening there, that packaging of information and sent in a way that like meant something to the person on the other side of it, like that was watching that program. So I think somewhere around there, I got that idea that like, okay, that could be interesting. I always enjoyed writing as well, and so I guess kind of in some beyond that, you're so young, you don't even really know what journalism. I mean, beyond those brief flashes of like, okay, I get it, but like you don't really know what it means to be a journalist when you're 15, or even when you start university. And I took journalism. I have an undergraduate degree in journalism from a university in Toronto. And that first year was rough because, it's one thing to like to write an essay for an English class. It's another thing to have to like talk to people and turn that into something else. But volunteering at the student newspaper at the university really kind of shifted that for me, like kind of getting just into the habit and the practice, like getting catching that thrill of like making something and or like learning about something that you didn't know, or exposing something like, you know, somewhat small in the context of a university world, but like those little things. And just one step at a time. Then I did an internship at a newspaper, and eventually I got a job, and I just one step at a time. And like I said earlier, for me, I think I really kind of clued into it these last few years working as a freelancer in Argentina, because my whole career was working for a newsroom, working under a brand of a media company. You're kind of guided by those ethics, ways of doing things. Journalism also has transformed so much over the course of my career. You know, how I thought about the work that I was doing 20 years ago is very different than how I think of my role and responsibility now, and perhaps even more so as an individual out here, right? Like these, of course, I have like industry ethics of accuracy and you know, sharing multiple points of view and all of that stuff. But then there are things that I consider important now about the way in which I deal with certain people that I interview. You know, this question of how you build consent with the people that you are talking to. I mean, it's one thing to interview like a lawmaker. It's another thing to interview a household worker. Does that person understand what that means? You know, how do you explain what this is about? How do you make them feel like, you know, if this isn't what you want to still do in a few weeks, we can talk about it. Like just kind of sharing a bit of that power with them, and just getting to talk to people and learn from people. That's why I still do the work I do. Yeah.
That's great. You answered a lot of, Lisa gave us a bunch of questions, and I think you answered a lot of them, but I want to kind of jump in midway here. And she said, how do you know when a story idea will work? And how do you come up with these story ideas?
How do you know when it'll work? I mean, yeah, it's a great question. It's like, what does it mean for it to work? Does it mean that it needs to be published? I guess that's like a fundamental thing. If someone agrees, that's when I know it works. But I think also, like, you know, after all of these years being a journalist, like it's not just that someone agrees. It's like, yeah, you know, I think it's I mean, for me, like it's often it's something, perhaps an individual, a particular story that I find very compelling, but it's within a context of, it says something bigger about something. So much of the work, I think, if we're talking about being a journalist where you're trying to send out, like my work is, I send out an email to editors that I now have a working relationship with, but I'm like, hey, this is what's happened here. I think this is my brief pitch on it. But I think so much of the work in that pitch is about the context, is about like the why this matters now, like why we should tell it from here. You know, sometimes like I guess there's a universality to so many of our stories, right? Like that is its strength, but then can also work against you as a journalist when you're trying to tell people, well, why should I hear about this from there? I think I don't know. I don't have a clear answer beyond something that is compelling about a story, typically about a person for me, and then you know, that context about, you know, why this place matters, what this might signal in terms of other kinds of changes. You know, we like journalism is a lot about, I think, change. So if we try to point to that, whether or not it's something new or like the journey along the way, or that's what think that's what we're drawn to as well, like the transformations that happen on an individual or a societal level. And so at least those are the things that I find interesting. And for the most part, I notice that editors and that publications find interesting as well.
Oh, nice. Thank you. We have a question from Norma. She said, hello, I'm wondering if their pay, I think she's referring to the house workers, has a range or is it regulated in any way?
Yeah, there is a there is a like the government publishes this is what a registered worker, like a pay scale for registered workers. And so within household workers, there's different classes, somebody who's like the supervisor of a household, for example, somebody who is a caregiver, somebody who's just doing like basic cleaning tasks. So there's 4 or 5 different categories. And there's a rate that changes every year. Argentina has insane inflation, and so that is reflected in that pay that changes. Of course, it doesn't. So the pay changes, but like everything else is also jumped by that amount or more. So it's not like people's purchasing power has changed, and in fact, it typically deteriorates. But the number changes. And so that's what they go by, and that's often what people will go by, even if they're unregistered. Perhaps they might bump it up a bit, but that's like the general. When we wrote these stories last year, it was about 300 pesos an hour, which I think was like $2, one or one and a half, $2, something like that. Yeah.
Thurston, I saw your hand raised. Do you want to ask this question, or do you want me to read your?
You can read it. It's the one at 254.
Yeah. Thurston asks, thank you. With possible pursuing a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, what can we all do to make situations like this better with women and minorities?
Hear from them, like listen to the in particular conditions in which they find themselves, and not assume that like these experiences, even within like particular areas or sectors, are always the same, or always they're facing the same kinds of hurdles, or that they haven't been able to raise their own voices and kind of like advocate for themselves. Like not to assume, basically to not assume, and to make space for people to articulate, what they know, what they've lived through, and how they have navigated it. To hear what has worked for them, I think is a basic first step.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to probably botch this, but I remember a quote from one of the articles where one of the women was saying that she was walking with other workers and was hearing their stories. And she said that she had it better, such circumstances. And could you talk a little bit about, because she had said something to the effect that I don't consider myself lucky. I feel like I'm getting what I deserve.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe that kind of, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it's like, again, when we talk about like the complexity of it, like there are women who have, I mean, I don't know if they would use the word fought, but they've just articulated like, these are the conditions under which I'm going to work. And this is a woman who is still part of one of these unions, and who, over the years has just learned or understood when it was that she needed to say, that these are my limits. And so her situation was one in which, her employer paid her salary while she was during the pandemic, as people were supposed to. Like, she was a registered worker. you were supposed to be at home, but you were supposed to be still getting a salary. That was the law, but that was hardly enforced. In her case, it was. Even before that, you know, she has sick leave, she has you know, paid vacation. You know, the employer had brought in a second person to help her so that she didn't have all of the load. It's a larger household, like on her alone. But that, you know, she also described that, like the journey to work, and she worked in like a gated community essentially. So she had that several train, bus chain to work, and it's like an army of women that are going to work, and that within that there's this great range of experience. People who, you know, didn't even feel able to say, I need a break. Can I have a glass of water? Right? Like, and I mean, I don't have an answer to the why, why, how that is, right? Like, but it's I certainly think though that in, you know, in these kinds of collective organizations where you have this range of experience and people can see how it is, you know, that you go about articulating your right, that has a real effect on others. Even just like that one-on-one exchange with someone else who's like, yeah, okay, I lived through that and this is how I handled it. This is what you should say. This is how you should approach it. I mean, we all do that in our own worlds. So I think like that community building and that, you know, sounding board is also like a huge part of what this organizing has helped achieve, even if it's not necessarily like reflected in there's more workers who are registered, right? Like how do we measure what the success is or what the benefit is of that kind of collective organization? I mean, I see it not just in this case, but I see it in the work of the broader work of the women's movement, that like in the midst of, you know, struggle and, you know, fighting for different kinds of legislative changes, you know, and oftentimes like in, you know, like fighting against things that like really enrage you, you know, like about like high levels of violence against women, you know, things that like make you feel like, is anything changing? But there's community in that mobilization of people. There's purpose that's being built there, people finding different kinds of purpose, and that like leads to moments that are like joyful, and that's perhaps, I think, the most powerful thing or like intangible thing that this kind of mobilization and organization leads to. You feel like you're not alone.
Yeah, and I think we can all relate that it's so important to have people you can talk to and reflect upon. I'm going to reach out to our audience. Are there any more questions for Natalie?
I have a question. In regards to the house workers in Argentina, and I don't know if maybe I just didn't catch this and you already answered this, but is there like a proportion of these women who are undocumented immigrants?
Yes, and it's not. I don't know if they would all. There's a proportion that are migrants, and that within that may have aspects of their status be in a gray zone. I don't know that it's not as clear cut necessarily as, you know, undocumented or not, because there's a different ability to work within South America, like in particular with countries that are bordering Argentina. So there's worker permits that exist. But yes, there are women that whose status may not be entirely clear, that may fear like whether or not it's a real threat or not, like may fear like deportation or some other kind of legal ramification based on that status. Yes, I can't. I believe specifically around this migrant worker definition. It's about 9 or 10% of the workforce, if I'm not of the household workforce, if I'm not mistaken.
And that would definitely be considered another problem with, getting registered.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it would be.
Right, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Anu, you have a question.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. So in Singapore, where I'm from, I just came back from Singapore. We're not talking about illegal migrant workers, but we have legal migrant workers. We rely heavily on workers from Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India, and all that to come. And then the women are usually home helpers. They help in the homes. Then the men are construction workers and all that. And during the COVID, I just posted an article here. During the COVID, these migrant workers were actually cordoned off or, housed in a dormitory-like thing. They were bused to work, and then they work and they come back, and they're not allowed out in the city streets at all. So it's almost like prison. This is a great article. Psychological effects, emotional, physical, and they're all cramped in tiny dormitories and of course the outbreak became really bad because of that close contact. So like I said, it's not like what happened in Argentina, but it is kind of similar as well. These are all registered workers, and there's still a lot of outcry, and questions are being asked why this was done and all that. So I just thought I'll share that with you.
No, that's amazing. Yeah, whether or not, like, sometimes the context may differ, but the experiences there's an echo of similarity within the experience, right? Like essentially like being treated as not equal, right? Whether or not they're being housed in particular places, or whether or not, in the case here in Argentina, where it's not like they're housed in specific areas. They're people who, living just part of society, but still are marginalized and othered as just a matter of course.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder, piggybacking onto that, if we had house workers and caregivers that were losing their jobs, and so they'd have to move into a lower income housing, how did that impact them with COVID of being exposed?
Totally, exactly. Like, in the case of Angelica, she had kind of seen how her living conditions over the years prior to the pandemic, but like had gradually degraded, right? Like she started off living in the house with the family. That's how she came here. And then she moved to she lived in one part of the city, then in another part of the city that was, that she felt more comfortable in. And eventually, just because based on her economic picture, like was ultimately living in like a rooming house, but in a very low income neighborhood, sharing a room with her adult son. We couldn't go into her home. Like she lived there before the pandemic, right? But we couldn't go in there because they had rules around, strangers coming into the house and COVID. So like very, very close quarters. And certainly, like, not to go off on too much of a tangent. I talked about the really long quarantine, but like there's in these neighborhoods that are the lower income neighborhoods where people are living in very crowded situations. The question of like there wasn't really household quarantine couldn't happen realistically could not happen in that context. So it was neighborhood quarantine, because in many respects, like it was worse to be in like a small room with several people. It was better to have that aspect of being outdoors. It's just that they contained them people were contained in a different way. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions from our audience? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Natalie, I want to thank you so much. You've shared so much insight, not only about the working conditions for the house workers, but also for our students. And Holly, thank you for joining us today, giving us a little information about the fellowship. Again, to our students, if you would like to apply for the fellowship, Chris Weaver has put his contact information in the chat and you can reach out to him. I did record this session, so when it's uploaded, I will share it with everyone. Natalie, do you have any final comments for us today?
No, I just thanks so much for the opportunity, and I'll also encourage you guys to apply to that fellowship. That sounds super exciting. I mean, what is a journalist beyond somebody who's just curious about something? So we all can do that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. This has been so rewarding. It's even better than I expected it, and I had high hopes. So thank you again so much. What a great experience.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.